Welcome to the next video in a multi-part series doing a crash course in Ismaili history. In the last video I talked about the Fatimid period of Ismaili history, and in this video I'm going to talk about the Alamut period in Ismaili history. So in the year 483 after Hijrah, or 1090 in the Common Era, there was an Ismaili Dai by the name of i-Sabbah, and he had seized a mountain fortress. i-Sabbah seized a mountain fortress in Alamut in northern Persia, and in the process of seizing this fort, he basically established a Nizari state in Alamut. Now, what was significant about this particular event is that the Ismailis who were in Persia at that time had otherwise been operating in a secret or clandestine fashion. Now, Hasan, when he had come over to Alamut, had actually severed his ties with the Fatimids, and the Fatimids had been ruling Egypt. By this point in time, however, they were now being ruled by al-Mustali rather than Nizar, even though both al-Mustali and Nizar had been the children of the Imam al-Mustansir. And so, because Hasan was now establishing this stronghold in Alamut at the behest of Nizar, really under the guidance of Nizar, he basically established an independent Nizari Dawa on behalf of the Imam Nizar. So a few years later, by 487 AH or 1094 AD, i-Sabbah really emerged as the undisputed leader of the Persian Ismailis. And in that sense, he was really the chief representative, the Hujjah of the Imam of the time, who at that time had been Imam Nizar. Now, the reason that the community needed a Hujjah rather than being read directly by the Imam Nizar is that Nizar had basically remained in hiding. He stayed in hiding because he was still being persecuted, and for his own safety did not make himself widely accessible, and in particular was not accessible or readily accessible by his followers. So i-Sabbah basically helped build the Ismaili community, or maybe more accurately, the Nizari Ismaili community in the area. He established a number of other strongholds in Persia and then extended his activities into Syria as well. The next three Imams after Nizar also remained in hiding in a similar fashion. They effectively had engaged in a period of concealment, the Dawr al-Satr again. And during this time, the community was led by Hujjas. The Hujjas included not only i-Sabbah, they also included a successor, Kia Buzurg Umid, who reigned from 518 to 532 after Hijrah, or 1124 to 1138 in the Common Era. And besides Kia Buzurg Umid, another Hujjat at the time was Muhammad bin Buzurg Umid, who reigned from 532 to 557 after Hijrah, or 1138 to 1162 in the Common Era. Now, these leaders did not divulge the names of the Imams subsequent to Nizar. Remember, the Imams at this point had entered another period of Dawr al-Satr, another period of concealment. And in that sense, the Hujjah basically acted like the chief representative of the Imam. The Dawr al-Satr in this case lasted during the Imamat of Nizar and the next three Imams, but they came out of hiding, the Ismaili Imams came out of hiding when Imam Hasan al-Lajq came about, and this was in the area, actually, so al-Lajq reign was from 557 to 561 AH, or 1162 to 1166 in the Common Era. And when he basically came out of hiding, he effectively ended the Dawr al-Satr, and the Imams, the Ismaili Imams at this point, took over the leadership and the reins of the Nizari state, following essentially Muhammad bin Buzurg Umid. So the Imams essentially no longer needed a Hujjah because they were no longer in concealment. And so you can see that in the Alamut state, it was effectively led by two Imams at this point, namely Nizar and al-Lajq, as well as three Imams in hiding. So a total of 5 Imams, as well as 3 different Hujjas. Now, the Ismailis in Alamut lived in very hostile circumstances. They were being persecuted and attacked and so on, and so they had to focus their energies on survival. And so as a result, during this period, there was not as much emphasis placed on things like literary and intellectual endeavors, but rather more emphasis was placed on military efforts. And because of their small size, the Ismailis had to be very selective in how they engaged in a military capacity. So, because they were still dealing with hostile elements and many hostile attempts towards them, what Hasan-Sabbah needed to do in order to maintain the Ismaili state, in order to really survive, is he needed to engage in very targeted attacks or targeted assassinations. And these assassinations were meant as a proactive measure to prevent large bloodshed or larger bloodshed, as the enemies of the Ismailis were looking to exterminate them, to end them. And the assassinations were carried out by skilled warriors who, being devoted to the Imam, were willing to sacrifice their own lives if needed. These individuals were called or known as fidais, and accounts of their assassinations really made their way into Western literature through the writings of Marco Polo. And Marco Polo had himself heard these accounts when he was visiting the Orient. Now, it is important to keep in mind that by this point in time, the stories had potentially taken on mythical proportions. Marco Polo actually wasn't even born until 1254 in the Common Era, which was some 130 years or so after the death of Hasan bin Sabbah. To make matters even more complicated, especially with regard to the historical record, is that much of Western scholarship on Ismaili history was written by parties who may have been hostile to the Ismailis, and therefore their writings may not have been the most accurate. Beyond that, because the Ismailis were persecuted, they often had to practice their faith in secret. They engaged in a practice called taqiyya, which I talked about in previous videos. And because they were engaged in taqiyya, it made it all the more difficult for them to study their doctrine and their history in a reliable fashion. So there's also a popular misconception that's been propagated through the writings of Marco Polo that the Ismaili fidais of Alamut were called assassins because they attempted to engage in assassination after they employed the drug hashish. Now, this misconception was really further spread in subsequent writings by historians who relied on Marco Polo's account of that time. But this theory doesn't seem to be consistent with linguistic evidence. In particular, the Arabic term for hashish is varkul kiyal, which, as you can tell, sounds nothing like the word assassin. And so that makes it unlikely that the term originated from local Muslim sources, but it does suggest that the term assassination was employed by people who were perhaps swayed by Marco Polo's account. Now, despite the increased emphasis on military efforts, the Nizari Ismailis themselves did not abandon, they didn't give up the literary tradition altogether. Quite the contrary, Hasan-Sabbah was a learned theologian in his own right, and he established a very impressive library in Alamut. More so, the library in Alamut, and really, in general, Alamut and the other major Nizari fortresses in both Persia and Syria were equipped with extensive libraries, with documents, with books, with scientific instruments, and so on and so forth. But having said that, in terms of actual doctrine, one important contribution during this period was the emphasis on talim. And talim basically is a doctrine that entails the necessity of authoritative teaching by the imam of the time. This doctrine itself was not new, but it was basically re-emphasized during the Alamut period of Ismaili history. In the 620s, after Hijrah, or 1220s in the Common Era, the Persian Nizari state was becoming weaker, largely as a result of prolonged struggles. What made the situation worse is that also the Mongols began to target the Ismailis as well. There was a great Khan, Monkey, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan. So Monkey was the grandson of Genghis Khan, and Monkey prioritized the literal destruction of the Ismaili state during the Mongol conquest of Western Asia. And his directives, Monkey's directives, were ultimately carried out by Monkey's brother, Hulagu Khan. And just by the way, as a matter of a historical reference, Monkey's other brothers included Arik Boke and Kubla Khan. So in this process, a large number of Ismaili Nizaris rather, were massacred in Alamut and in surrounding areas. The Alamut fortress itself was surrendered to the Mongols in 654 after Hijrah, or 1256 in the Common Era, and this surrendering occurred during the imamate of Imam Ruknuddin Kersha. And subsequent to that, the other Ismaili outposts were taken over. And so, as a result, the Alamut state and the surrounding outposts essentially were no longer under Ismaili control. And we really, at this point, leave the Alamut period, and we'll now talk about the post-Alamut period in Ismaili history, which I'll do in the next video.